Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Hubert, many thanks for joining us today at Tech the New Era from Johannesburg. I know that you recently started a new initiative called Africa PLC, which is all about really encouraging trade right across the globe with Africa and the African nations. Can you tell me a little bit more about Africa PLC and how it came about?
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff. And as I say, I'm really glad to be part of this very dynamic discussion. My name is Hubert Danso, and I, as you know, I chair the African Union's Continental Business Network. Now, that's a grouping of the foremost institutional investment, infrastructure investors, and logistics business leaders operating on the African continent. We came together some time to solve for a number of different key challenges that were stifling and limiting cross-border trade on the African continent. And there were a few problems that we sort of sought to solve. One is on the big data component. The other one is creating market access. And then that, formidable challenge that's been out there for quite some time, which is that logistics and last mile logistics challenge, as well as access to finance. So the combination of working with a number of key institutions, the International Chamber of Commerce, the Chartered Institute of Purchase and Supply, a number of major trade finance banks and corporates, was the platform that we launched called Africa PLC, Africa Public Limited Company, Africa Private Limited Company, which is essentially a business-to-business, a business-to-government e-trade and fintech platform to facilitate trade in support of Africa's $3.2 trillion African continental free trade area.
And is it primarily developed in order to develop partnerships between companies outside of Africa and within Africa? Because I think a lot of companies have a reluctance sometimes to trade with Africa because it's just so confusing. It's such a huge market, and the channels to market are a wee bit unknown to them. Is part of it about that?
Yes, I mean, I think you've touched on the key motivators and functionality that the platform has. As I mentioned, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is effectively by number of countries the largest free trade area in the world. It's about a $3.2 trillion GDP collective in terms of economic space. And that came about after a lot of negotiations and great leadership by African heads of state, because we recognized that, our intra-African trade was very low, anywhere in the region between 14 to 16%, depending on whose research you rely. So primarily the platform supports intra-African trade, companies within one part of Africa transacting and trading and fulfilling and financing trade within the African continent. But a greater challenge that's linked into the genius behind the African Continental Free Trade Area is that it's going to catalyze a lot of investment and a lot of trading activity that will make Africa much more competitive in terms of its ability to trade globally and get access to that global market. At current times, we have less than sort of 2% of global trade. But to your question, the mere fact that we have created this platform and support the African Continental Free Trade Area to boost intra-African trade, and having this single channel, it really does enable and sort of de-demonize and demystify the opportunities for international companies to be able to access the African market. So they can now come in through one platform. They can now look at very specific and segmented vertical markets. So if you're in the healthcare sector, there's a healthcare marketplace constituted where there are key buyers and sellers and the financiers and all of the key healthcare procurers are all in one place, rather than what you have now is it's a very manual process, to get the data, to be able to analyze the data, to be able to vet your counterparty, to be able to finance the goods, deliver the goods, and maintain that relationship is a very manual and cumbersome process. And one that we have found that has basically just led a number of our global and domestic trading partners to just not want to trade with Africa. So we believe that being able to remove these very specific challenges through a digital platform that has blockchain trade finance and logistics capabilities, as well as big data to be able to understand the classification of the goods, ensure that they're bona fide, and ensure that the counterparty is a reputable company with a good track record, we think is very transformative.
And your background is very much focused on infrastructure and or has been prior to Africa PLC, and opening up the at least the information about large capital and infrastructure projects. Do you think that then this is kind of the next stage where SMEs and smaller organizations trading goods and services really can get access to that market? Because it has been a slow process, really, hasn't it, in terms of that accessibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my personal passion is, enfranchising small and medium-sized enterprises. So to be able to have a platform like Africa PLC to do that has been an absolute pleasure. But prior to actually getting involved in the infrastructure investment space, hot out of university in Sussex in the UK, where I read my LLM in international commercial law, I actually spent a number of years at the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, where I used to head up their global trade and customs policy commissions, as well as their relationships with intergovernmental organizations. So that ability to be able to reconcile some of the regulatory and policy frameworks that are required to create a more hospitable environment, particularly to support SMEs, has been a critical part of this journey. And unfortunately or fortuitously, we now have COVID-19, which has really precipitated trade and customs distancing. So it's really come at the right time when, in the absence of being able to have that face-to-face contact as we did pre-COVID-19, digital trade and digital access is really the only way for small and medium-sized enterprises to survive. So it's a very critical role that technology, as you know, is playing. I think we're seeing that across a number of different governments. And we're very fortunate to be able to, through the Continental Business Network, work very closely in a very practical way with a number of African policymakers, as well as heads of state that are wholly committed to enfranchising and really helping our small and medium-sized enterprises trade, survive, and thrive ultimately through into this new digital agenda. As you know, the small and medium-sized sector in Africa is really our largest employer. So we really need to really focus and give them all the support that we can, so that they can continue to be a major contributor towards economic and social development on the continent.
Absolutely. And it is said that there is kind of a tipping point where certain economies have to get to a certain point before the economic growth really takes off. Can you give us a sense in terms of what you know about the African nations, as to which nations are probably the most dynamic, the furthest ahead, the most likely to see very rapid growth, the types of growth that we've been seeing, in Southeast Asia and India to some extent as well? Which nations are really getting there and getting it in terms of tech and economic development?
Well, I'll probably pick off the last part of your question first, because I was at a very interesting discussion just a few weeks ago, and everyone was asking, what do you think the largest company in Africa will be in 10 years? And the answer that got the most resonance is that company probably has not been created yet. That's the level of innovation and pace that we're actually seeing that will be enabled and driven through technology. Now, what does that mean in terms of answering your question? What that really means is different countries are at very different paces of embracing technology and putting in place that enabling policy and regulatory framework in close collaboration with their local private sectors. So I don't actually think anyone is much further ahead than the others. It's really going to be a case of who is really going to drive a wholehearted effort to push this whole digital agenda. Now, who's at the front runner in terms of the most visible, in terms of being innovative? I think Rwanda has got a very strong profile under the stellar leadership of President Paul Kagame. You're talking about robotics being used in trade distancing times right now within and across Rwanda. You're seeing drones being used across East Africa. But again, you've got a dynamic sector, you've got a dynamic tech sector in South Africa, and that's not just in Cape Town, but that's also across a number of the cities, in particular Johannesburg. I think it's well documented that Nairobi is a great hub in East Africa. Lagos in Nigeria are really driving some very innovative activities. You've seen a lot of Silicon Valley missions going to all of those different jurisdictions. And as I keep mentioning, this Africa Continental Free Trade Area is an absolute game changer for the continent, and we think for the world in some respects. And their secretariat is located in Accra, in Ghana, and there's a thriving and vibrant tech and accelerator community there. And again, it's always receiving, or has been at least pre-COVID, receiving delegations of tech investors and tech leaders from across the globe and the most known destinations like Silicon Valley, India, and elsewhere. So I think what I'm really saying, Africa is really going to be a continent to watch, because one of the things that we keep hearing and the messages that keep being put across by a number of the global tech leaders is be very careful to recognize and preserve and protect the value that you have in terms of you don't have too many legacy systems that you have to address. So really focus in on the leapfrog capacity and opportunity to be able to accelerate your development. And that sort of comes back to the point that, it's going to really be a hotbed for growth, and the countries and the sub-regions that really pick up on that can do very well. And we've seen one interesting conversation, particularly in the health tech sector, where, the continent has suffered in some respects from having to import so many of the critical inputs, particularly in the healthcare sector, around food security in the agri sector. But the reality is we're not the only continent that's having that problem, and that we've identified that we're too dependent on external supply chains or one or two particular countries. Now we're seeing a reconfiguration and approaches from a number of different countries who are looking to do a couple of things. One, they're looking to create a bit more diversity and predictability around security of supply for healthcare and health tech and food security. But they're also looking to mobilize their pension funds and their institutional investors and provide incentives for cross-border trade. So when you marry those two, and the fact that the continent's got a very young and thriving and well-educated population, then we can really begin to see Africa's manufacturing capacity, the ability to leverage and create that enabling environment for technology, create a new dynamic, a new form of international cross-border trade partnership between Africa and other countries on a bilateral basis, and Africa and other continents on a bilateral basis in a similar way, but cross-continental.
And the timing is perfect as well, because there's a lot of talk about a potential emerging Cold War between the West and China, the West becoming highly dependent on China in terms of its supply chain, and major manufacturers, or rather subcontract manufacturers, now looking at other jurisdictions where they can potentially site plants. So do you think that that potentially could play to Africa's advantage as well?
Absolutely. That's just in line with the point that I made. We're receiving on a regular basis. I mean, I've just got off 3 calls even prior to this meeting today from all from different continents, looking at precisely this particular opportunity to be able to facilitate that cross-border trade relationship, but not just from the traditional motivators, but really to create that sovereignty of supply and new a new form of tech-driven bilateral relationships. As you say, the world is becoming much more multipolar. And as a consequence of that, all of the existing supply chains are having to be reconfigured because we were dependent on a system that we grew very accustomed to, and we just took it for granted. Now, when all the borders are closed, we're having to look for new suppliers, new terms, new relationships, reevaluate the governance within the different supply chains, and artificial intelligence, RegTech, blockchain. These are all the enablers to be able to, accelerate the ability to make that transition. So it's a very exciting time, Jeff.
Absolutely, and yeah, there's a sort of coalescing of not just macroeconomic factors, but also technologies themselves that can underpin a lot of these solutions. And blockchain is one. I think there's a big theme really emerging from the Tech the New Era, the event, where we're going to be discussing how blockchain is acting almost as a leapfrogging impact, in terms of the creation of new technology companies, new technology models. Just on the infrastructure point again, what's it looking like in terms of the development, say, of broadband infrastructure and also mobile infrastructure? Is that potentially a bottleneck in terms of certain nations, that the infrastructure isn't getting in fast enough?
Well, I think one of the key things that we at the Continental Business Network have been working hard with our leaders to focus on is really to have digital infrastructure mainstreamed with the classical infrastructure that we look at in terms of power and transport and social infrastructure. We really have worked hard to ensure that now digital infrastructure is really seen as that attractive and competitive investable asset class. So there are a number of opportunities in the sort of digital infrastructure space. And then, of course, when you can marry that with the services that typically benefit from that and overlay that, particularly e-trade, e-commerce, whether it's B2B or B2C or B2G, again, represents good opportunity. But, there's a lot of talk about 5G, but we also have to be quite realistic and recognize that, we've in the continent probably got a bit of an oversupply of 4G. And so, a lot of the issues we've still got to deal with, particularly at the consumer level, is affordability. And, as we've seen a number of countries that are beginning to investigate and test just a little bit, there's a handful at the moment, 5G. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to put the right business model in place. And that's predominantly going to be driven by the fact that we need to continue to work with our governments to put the right regulatory environment in place that can unlock the necessary investment opportunities. And those investment opportunities do exist. I think in the first context, they're likely to be much more driven by public sector institutions, the customers, as well as private institutions, until that business model is a bit more affordable and accessible to the average consumers. But again, when you can take a view on the value proposition being a global one, then the faster, the better, the quicker, the cheaper, and more dynamic infrastructure that you have in place, that's clearly going to go towards enhancing your global competitiveness. And make no mistake, as the continent, we are very committed to, increasing our share of global trade and competitiveness in this post-COVID-19 economy.
Hubert, you recently attended the UK Africa Investment Summit in London. Do you sense that the relationship between the United Kingdom and Africa is a strong one and potentially getting stronger? Do you have a good sense of what came out of that conference, that there is a real commitment?
Yes, Jeff, I certainly do. I've had the privilege to attend not just the UK Africa Investment Summit, but a number of the others, including FOCAC, the China Africa Summit, the India Africa Summit, the Tokyo International Conference for African Development, the Russia Africa Summit. And, the follow-up and the focus and the levels of commitment from the British from the UK Africa Summit, I think have been first class and head and shoulders in many respects above what we see in a number of the other bilateral forums. I can say that from personal experience, because we're involved in a lot of the follow-ups, and I've had follow-ups with ministers that have approached us for follow-ups. So it's not one of those situations where you have to go and follow up and see whether the actual outcome was the fact that the event took place, but rather, it's like is it all about the wedding or is it about the marriage? I think the British government is very much about the marriage. The approach that I've seen really plays very positively into the point that I made earlier on in our conversation, which is there is a new form of partnership that has been precipitated not only by COVID-19, but just by the advent of technology and its role in fintech and trade. And I think the credentials of the United Kingdom, particularly as a global fintech competitive destination, as well as a global leader in tech, bodes very well for the relationship between Africa and the United Kingdom, and in particular, the African continental free trade area. So if we can marry those elements, and as I mentioned in our previous conversations, we've had very dynamic engagements with the permanent secretaries from both the Department for International Development, DFID, as well as the permanent secretary from the Department for International Trade, who are driving these initiatives. And I can say again, firsthand, it is not lip service, very practical, very mutually rewarding and balanced and equitable discussions around how a new form of e-trade and tech-driven relationship can be beneficial not only to Africa or the UK, but for the global trading system equally. So yes, I think it was a very, very positive activity and event, and I think that we'll all be very positively surprised when we start hearing a number of announcements of partnerships between the African private sector and the British private sector, supported by the likes of the Department for International Trade and the Department for International Development. So we're very optimistic.
Excellent. Listen, Hubert, I really appreciate your time, and it's wonderful to have so many positive messages about the opportunities for trade with Africa. And I just wish you every success and look forward to meeting you soon when all these travel restrictions are eliminated in London or indeed in Johannesburg. So thank you very much indeed.
It's my pleasure, Jeff, and please keep up the great work. This is the type of leadership that we need that brings us all together. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.